Now I know it's not an all-press event. Listen, thank you for joining us. Well, I am sitting in the audience today because this is really, you're going to hear from the folks who really did this work, and it's amazing work. MTA C&D President Jamie Torres-Springer, Deputy Chief Development Officer Frederica Cuenca, who's been working on planning for the MTA for a very, very long time, Dr. Mike Schiffer, who is the SVP of Regional Planning, and Capital Strategy Head at C&D, Alyssa Cobb-Kanan. So those are the folks who have really done this amazing work. Listen, today is an important day for the MTA. We're unveiling the long-awaited 20-year needs assessment, which is the most detailed inventory of the MTA network that's ever been done. Let's be clear, in the past, our MTA capital programs were developed based on the information available, but it was pretty limited. So, for example, in the 2013, the 2015 to 24 needs assessment, folks were operating based on a budget envelope. They were given an amount of money that was available for the capital budget, and they would then develop a list of priority projects, most of which were pre-selected. This is a different process. This is a detailed assessment of the MTA's entire network. It's never been done before. Over 6 million assets and components have been evaluated. This is good government at work, ladies and gentlemen. This is different. For the last 2 years, the team has been looking at all those components and assets to determine where we are and what improvements are needed to preserve and modernize the system. At the same time, taking into account the incredible changes that we've undergone in the wake of COVID, changes in how people are using transit, and especially impact of climate change. Look at last week's storm if you need a reminder of what we're up against, just in terms of climate change. I talk a lot about the importance of transit in this region. You've all heard me say that for New Yorkers, transit is like air and water. We need it to survive. But it's no exaggeration. We know that New York's success and survival depends on a super high-functioning transit system. Listen, earlier this year we celebrated the legacy of Dick Ravitch as that great MTA leader passed on. The reason we have a capital program in the first place is because Dick Ravitch understood the importance of transit. He was a lifelong New Yorker, and he made the case to the then governor, Hugh Carey, that it was important to invest in transit and bring the system back to life. And Ravitch's plan worked. Since then, at that time, subway cars were breaking down every 6,000 miles. Today, that stat, what we call mean distance between failures, is 120,000 miles. There is a 2,000% improvement as a result of investing in new rolling stock, but also in getting going the program of regular scheduled overhauls of our subway cars. That's what you can do when you start to invest in the system and attack the problems. But while the trains do break down a lot less frequently, and there's obviously mostly a lot less graffiti, we still have a ton of work to do. Components that were middle-aged in the Ravitch era are now old and decrepit and struggling to accommodate the explosion in ridership that has taken place since the 1980s and 1990s. We have to keep going in order to achieve the state of good repair that Dick Ravitch dreamed of. And while we're at the same time planning for the second half of this century, new travel patterns, new technologies, new jobs, new patterns of economic growth, we can't be afraid to expand where it makes sense to meet the needs of our population and the region. For 100 years, the system has barely grown. In fact, by some standards, it's contracted. Now, the analysis completed in this document offers different ideas about how we might expand to serve historically disadvantaged communities and give them better rail access, for example. But I need to underscore that a precondition of expansion, talking about new lines and new systems, is we have to be responsible and invest in the system we have. We can't, expand our house while we're letting the existing house fall apart. I think you all get it. It's human logic. And it's not going to come cheap. the basics of private sector business says if you own a $1.5 trillion asset like we do, we have an industrial asset that's worth, current valuation done as part of this process, $1.5 trillion, you would be investing many, many billions of dollars in that asset every year. We are well short of that. The 20-year needs assessment is how we're going to set us on the right course to the next capital program. This is not our proposal for that 2025 to 2029 capital program. This is the level set, the development of an incredibly broad information base in order to let everybody, the public, stakeholders, transit experts, elected officials, everybody participate in the discussion of what that next capital program ought to be. But it starts with everybody being fully educated about the condition of the system. So with that, let me turn it over to Jamie and thank all of you who worked so hard on this to bring this day about. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Lieber, Jano. We have to give you special recognition here because as the founding president of MTA Construction and Development, you committed to conducting this needs assessment in this fashion. You formed this team, and maybe more importantly, your leadership of the whole MTA. You have been relentless in pushing us to conduct this assessment in a rigorous way and pushing all of our colleagues to participate with us. So thank you for your obvious leadership and huge contributions to this. This is a very intimidating group to be speaking to. There's so many of us here who work day in and day out to run the system, but also to conduct an assessment like this and make capital investments. So it's even more scary than facing the press. But we've got a pretty solid piece of work here that we're very proud of. There's a lot of people I could call out and recognize. Very happy to be joined by fellow agency presidents, Kathy Sheridan, Kathy Rinaldi, Rob Free, soon or now, any minute now. I know Rich Davey is out of town, but no one is a stronger supporter and collaborator with us on advancing the capital program than he is. And Demetrius Cricklow and Frank Anacaro are with us, certainly representing New York City Transit and all the great work that we do. Board members here I want to acknowledge, and also the executive leadership of MTA Construction and Development, Evan Iceland, Tim Mulligan, Frederica Cuenca, Mark Roche is here somewhere, and I'm sure Sean Moore is here somewhere, and Dr. Rosalind Green. So it's a great crowd. Most importantly, largely in the front couple of rows of the two side sections here are the dozens of people in the new MTA Consolidated Planning Group that have prepared this assessment and really worked, around the clock for the last 2 years to do some very difficult planning, analysis, and work, and we are extremely grateful for all of your contributions to this. This is really your document. We're excited to release the 20-year needs assessment today. As Jano said, this is also the launch of planning for the next capital program, the 2025 to the 2029 capital program. This is not the next capital program. Day in and day out, the dedicated staff of MTA Construction and Development work on executing the current capital program. And let's just keep in mind, it's a $55 billion capital program. It's 70% larger than the previous capital program, and increasingly we are bringing that work in on time and on budget or under budget, allowing us to rededicate those resources to other projects. But we know we have much more work to do in maintaining and improving that $1.5 trillion asset that Jana was referring to, which is why we created that consolidated planning unit at Construction and Development that has spent the last 2 years getting us ready for the next plan. We're really proud of how this document and how it was created. We set out to take a comprehensive look at the system's needs, focusing on what will make it last for the next 100 years. And this type of approach is rare. It may be unprecedented at this scale to have approached something in this way. I've been around a lot of capital planning efforts in my career. Usually they fall short of the mark. Very often, unfortunately, it's due to not having enough resources, not having enough time dedicated to doing a proper planning effort like this. But as Jana was saying, they also often jump ahead of the hard work. They'll take a budget, they'll allocate it to different departments, and they'll make the assessment fit that budget. We very explicitly set out not to do that for the first time at the MTA, and as I say, in an unprecedented way at this scale. The professional approach that we have taken is step by step. Publish the information today, an objective assessment of what the system needs in order to survive and flourish and respond to the environment we're working within. Then create the plan, which is where funding constraints come in, which we will do by next year. We've mentioned the system is a $1.5 trillion asset. We've looked at every one of the nearly 6 million components in that asset. Some highlights: 8,700 rail cars, 6,000 buses, over 1,000 rail bridges. Often we talk about our 472 subway stations, but we've also got 21 Staten Island stations and over 200 commuter rail stations. Obviously, the 7 bridges and 2 tunnels of the Bridges and Tunnels Agency, 2,600 miles of track, over 100 maintenance shops, 493 elevators, and growing that inventory at a fast pace. Not mentioned here, 68 rail yards, 429 power substations, a lot of assets. We brought in every data source available: regular and comprehensive inspections, surveys of longtime staff who are the ones who really know how the system works and what it takes to keep it running, use of our new enterprise asset management system, which is a new tool. Lots of progress made on that, lots of progress to come, but this application of it for the first time is very useful. A new climate planning division led by Eric Wilson and a great team, already committed to an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, more to come on climate planning. The first level playing field comparative evaluation of potential expansion projects, which I'll come back to in a minute. The result is the most rigorous and transparent 20-year needs assessment in MTA history, which will be hugely helpful for us and the public and all interested stakeholders as we consider the next 5-year plan. You can see the bedrock of it is that every asset is inventoried and rated on a condition scale from 1 to 5, poor, marginal condition, up to excellent condition. And spoiler alert here, we have a lot of assets that are in poor and marginal condition, as you can see with this sample of a table. I believe this is a Metro North inventory. So this plan, again, just to summarize off the top, is, and I'm wearing the button, is really about state of good repair. That's where we're going with this assessment. Now, we're undertaking this at a moment of great optimism at the MTA and progress. The governor and the legislature solve the operating budget deficit for the foreseeable future that's caused by the disruption of COVID. Across the MTA, operating agencies are seeing on-time performance up, record levels, customer satisfaction is rising. And on the capital side, we've invested heavily in the system over the past 40 years with successive capital plans, including, as I mentioned, this one we're in, which is 70% larger than the last one. But what the assessment revealed is a massive need for ongoing investment throughout our system. We can see it in the system. We hear customer concerns. We use the system. We see it every day. Also, there's an incredible amount of need behind the curtain in the assets that keep the system running. As our system ages and undergoes major change, more and more investment is going to be necessary to maintain and improve all aspects of it, both in front of the curtain and behind the curtain. Why? That's thanks to a few key challenges that really drive this needs assessment that we must confront all at once. The 3 existential threats that are driving this assessment are the age of our infrastructure. More than 98% of Metro North service could be disrupted or suspended if the Grand Central train shed and the tunnels leading to it were to fail. Power failures could lead to frequent service disruptions, as the 75% of subway system substations that are more than 50 years old fail. Climate change. After last week, we probably don't need to convince anyone. We were very proud of how quickly service was restored, but it's going to get harder as these storms keep intensifying. We need investment, otherwise we're going to see more frequent and longer-term disruptions to our systems as a result of climate change. Services like, again, Metro North, the Hudson Line, could be literally underwater as the Hudson River rises. And evolving rider needs, this is a complicated set of threats. Our riders are changing. Everything from remote work, which we spend a lot of time talking about, to the expectation of up-to-the-second friction-free travel information and digital connectivity and smooth access to the system by tapping and going or otherwise. The risk here is that a critical mass will choose alternative forms of transportation, those who can, or not travel at all, which undermines the future of the whole region. We can't go in that direction. So the needs assessment responds to these threats with 3 categories of potential investments. I'll go through each in detail, but we're focused on rebuilding, which means achieving state of good repair for those assets that are in poor and marginal condition and beyond. Improvements, continuing to evolve our system to make it ADA accessible, prepared for climate risks, and better at providing timely information and access to riders. And we also evaluate proposals to expand the system, which we'll come back to. So rebuild. Each agency has its own risks and opportunities. For New York City Transit, we must replace aging substations, and we, in this time frame, can install CBTC, which allows us to improve reliability by modernizing the signal system for 90% of passenger trips by 2045 to greatly enhance reliability. I know that my colleagues at New York City Transit are excited about the mountain we have to climb on that, but we all know that it's important. We also, in this assessment, focus on functionally obsolete shops and yards to a greater extent than we have before. They need to be renovated for the 21st century. There's an example featured in the document, the Livonia shop, built 101 years ago. It's prevented transition of the fleet on the 3 train from R62s because it simply can't service the cars. The roof isn't high enough, not to mention the employee conditions within that shop. It's just an unacceptable way to expect our employees to work, and it doesn't help us at all to maintain and improve service on that line, and we need to deal with it. On the railroads, as I said before, for Metro North, we're focused on what we're thinking of as the Grand Central Artery, the train shed underneath Park Avenue, the tunnel to the north of the train shed, and the viaduct up to and around 125th Street, which we've already started work on, but each of those need major capital improvements during this 20-year period, or they could fail. And again, that's what makes Midtown Midtown and provides access to the city for so many who live in Westchester and other counties to get into the city. We need to protect the Hudson Line. We need to rebuild Harlem Line platforms before they crumble and make other improvements to both of those lines. For Long Island Railroad, we have opportunities to rehabilitate viaducts all over the island to prevent disruptions. Here in the city, we can reconstruct the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, which is another key aging asset that needs work to stay in service for another 100 years. And we can improve signals and centralize control to improve operations. These are just some highlights. For all of the agencies, it's worth noting that within this 20-year time period, we need to replace about 63% of our rolling stock in order to keep service running. That's a huge amount of work we have to do. We know that rolling stock is very difficult for a whole number of reasons. We have a great team working on it, but we need to ramp that up over the next 20 years. Also, we're building a lot of escalators and elevators. Most elevators and escalators in our system need to be replaced during this 20-year time period. Doing the important work to make sure our bridges and tunnels can continue to serve as a vital access point to the islands that we live on and work on, with innovative approaches that we're taking at B&T to how we preserve cables and replace bridge decks to carry the volume of traffic that they need to carry. Coming to the improve section, the improvements to the existing system, we're very focused on moving towards 95% ADA accessibility, a commitment we've made to get to by 2055. Within this 20-year period, as we focus on the stations that have highest ridership and also significant needs to provide ADA accessibility for a variety of reasons, we are going to get to 90% of customers able to use ADA accessible stations by 2045, by the end of this 20-year period. Also, we're, in this needs assessment, making a commitment to get to 95 50% of railroad stations, full-time railroad stations within this 20-year period, ADA accessible. Sustainability within the improved category. Of course, we talk about this a lot. The MTA saves the region 20 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions a year. New Yorkers have the lowest emissions in the country per capita as a result of that. And the best way to sustain that is to continue to grow ridership, with this, which this plan enables us to do. But we've committed to an 85% reduction in our own greenhouse gas emissions from operations by 2040 versus 2015 emissions levels. There's a lot to come on that. Climate Action Plan is separately coming later this year to outline additional commitments that the MTA is making to that. It definitely includes a transition during this 20-year period to an all-electric bus fleet. So that's a major need that's emphasized in this assessment. We saw that the system needs to be resilient and address multiple hazards last week. Flash flooding, coastal storms exacerbated by sea level rise. We should definitely also mention that heat is another issue that we're confronting, and we're systematically assessing what those risks are and thinking about how to respond to them. We're very proud that the system was back on Friday, much more quickly than after previous flash flooding events. Some of the interventions that we've made work. There are surgical interventions like raising vents, which you can see on the left, raising steps leading to stations, had a big impact. Also, other major interventions we've made, Coney Island Yard, the fact that because of our post-Sandy rebuilding investments, we were able to drain the yard quickly, meant a minimal disruption to service for the lines that are serviced out of that yard. But we have a lot more work to do that's identified in this assessment, and we also need to work with our partners to make interventions. Last set of improvements is continuing to modernize our 100-year-old system in ways that bring delight to riders so that they continue to use the system. We're very proud of the progress we're making on Omni. 42% of rides were taken most recently in the most recent weeks using Omni, but more importantly, 67% of full fare customers used Omni, and as we roll out accessibility for Omni for reduced fare and other customers, we expect that number to skyrocket, and that's going to happen in the short term. We had a blue ribbon panel that identified a series of measures we need to take to address fare evasion. On the physical side, in terms of this needs assessment, we've already begun to implement new fare gates and other measures to stem fare evasion through physical means. We're piloting technologies now, and that will make a difference in this needs assessment period. And of course, we're improving technology, great new app, lots more to come, but connectivity within the whole system, that commitment that we've made so that everybody can be connected is really critical as well. So if we ignore these threats, the consequences will be dire for our system and for our region. But just want to be clear, this isn't a doom and gloom plan. You can see two alternative futures that we've outlined here. And we're very concerned about a lack of investment leading us down the path to that grayer set of outcomes that we all would like to avoid. But if we rebuild the system for another 100 years, we can make generational investments to reconstruct and enhance our most important assets. We can add capacity where it's needed most. We can modernize the system, make it more accessible, and accelerate the fight against climate change. We're also looking at potential expansion projects in this needs assessment. But I should be clear that, again, with the focus on state of good repair, only if we get the resources that we need to address needs within the existing system does it make sense. But this document performs a groundbreaking comparative evaluation of potential expansion projects, the first of its kind and the most rigorous and comprehensive, I think, ever undertaken, based on having seen some of the other efforts that have been made. Mike and his team looked at every proposal on a level playing field, considered costs versus benefits, including not just benefits in terms of time saved, but important benefits like equity, resiliency, leveraging the capacity of the existing system, and so on. Some highlights of that evaluation, the Interborough Express, which is a project that we've talked about a lot over the last couple of years, scores very well because it saves a lot of time and provides benefits to neighborhoods and areas of the city that are much in need of transit accessibility. There's a whole lot of detail in this chart. This is not a set of recommendations that the MTA is making. It's not a commitment to funding anything. It's an effort to rigorously go through and put everything on a level playing field. And frankly, the way that we did this was we set out to avoid planning failures that we've seen in the past. Everybody has a favorite example where an artificially low cost estimate or an overly optimistic schedule for a poorly scoped project could help win public support for the work, only to result in a project that is underfunded and behind schedule in day one. So Mike and his team took a big step back, re-scoped each of these projects, created a new estimate, and we are set up now for a much better public dialogue about which of these projects make sense to proceed with. I mentioned that we're seeing very interesting results. This is the reason that you do this work. The Interborough Express is a project that looks quite attractive from a cost-benefit point of view. Also, the potential expansion of 2nd Avenue subway, not to the south, but west along 125th Street, either to St. Nicholas or to Broadway. So work to be done based on that assessment, but very interesting results. So what comes next? As I mentioned, we'll create the capital plan for 2025 to 2029 to be taken to the board by next fall. And there are two sides, this is a sort of summary of what we've just talked about. There are two sides to maintaining full service. We've got the operating commitment to maintaining full service, but we have to fully maintain the system. You can't maintain 70% of the system because at the moment we have something in the order of 70% ridership. We have to maintain 100% so that we can get back to that 100% ridership. Of course, we're going to continue to make the case and do the work to support the case that we are a responsible steward of public dollars. The Construction and Development Agency at the MTA is delivering better, faster, and cheaper. We see these results. Third track, the Canarsie Tube, Long Island Railroad Concourse, projects consistently finishing on time, on budget, under budget, getting done faster, which is critical to meeting goals like ADA accessibility, and demonstrating savings as we move on. So that's our plan. Very pleased to have had a few minutes to present it in some detail here. And just as something special, since we've got a lot of the key staff at the MTA present in the room, we assembled our key executive leadership for this plan on a panel, and I want to take a seat and ask them a couple of questions. I'll start with Frederica Cuenca. Jano introduced Frederica, the Deputy Chief Development Officer of Construction Development, who has built this planning operation that's produced this plan. Frederica, you've been around the MTA in a number of different roles. I give you credit for almost every important thing that's happened at the MTA in the last 20 years. You're often too humble to accept it. But of course, you've most recently been pivotal in creating C&D itself and the Consolidated Planning Unit. Can you talk about how your work getting to this assessment responded to what you've experienced historically at the MTA?
So I love working across the agencies. It's just been such a joy during my career here. So I really did sort of jump at that opportunity to do that work, to do the planning work on a cross-agency basis. And as Jano and Jamie both mentioned, we at the outset set a goal of saying we are going to be very focused on the data. We are going to be data-driven. We're going to look at the data. We're going to collect this data, and we're going to try to understand it and go where it takes us. So we really started with that, and that is a partnership with all of the amazing people that keep the system running, the operating agencies, and building on the knowledge that they know and the understanding and talking with them about it, and how do we use the information that they have to tell the story of their assets. So that was a very critical, important first step. Second, we pushed ourselves to look at the 20-year period. Not just how do you accomplish what's the most important thing, but how do we say, how do we keep the system running over 20 years? What does it really need over a 20-year period? And so when you do that, you really have to think about, how do I get this done? How much do we really need to do? Not just what's most important, but how do we set ourselves up for the service and the infrastructure that we need to run, you know, into the future for forever. So that was really, really important. And as a result of that process, we have the most comprehensive, most data-driven assessment available ever, and it's really the start of that dialogue and the understanding across the region with our stakeholders of what the system needs.
Great. Alyssa, you joined the MTA a couple of years ago to create the capital planning and strategy and planning unit. It's become farcical that I can never remember what the exact name of it. But you and I have known each other for a long time. You've done some extraordinarily courageous things in capital planning over the years. And when you arrived here and since, your mantra to me has always been that we need to really plan at the MTA. So what did you mean by that? And are we now finished with that?
Well, the easy answer is we're not done. This is just the beginning. And I guess I would say when I came in here, I think, you know, the three main pillars of planning are defining a problem, setting out the goals and long-term outcomes that you want to achieve, and then three, how do you get there? So I'd say this 20-year needs assessment really tried to do those first two things in particular, defining the problem and how to, you know, what are our goals, where do we want to be 20 years from now? It was an incredible opportunity to step back and think about what we do want to be 20 years from now, and more specifically thinking about how do we define the problem. As people have been saying, you know, state of good repair, really important for us to get there, but what does that mean? And I think that trying to find a way to define that problem and make it clear to our constituents out there beyond the people who are working on it day to day, that was really what we tried to undertake here, is to try to explain that to people. So in our document, we have case studies looking at specific assets to try to tell their stories, but we've also been really comprehensive and provided basically this like little report card on what is the condition of our system. So anyway. And
I think you've accomplished that, but I do want you to just tell us whether we're finished now.
Oh, we're not done. So the third part of the stool there is what do we do next to get there? And that's really that 5-year plan, and that is our next step.
Great. Mike, you're the MTA's long-range planner. You're both one of the purest examples of a train aficionado that I've ever encountered, but also incredibly rigorous and objective. Your love of trains hasn't led you to overestimate the benefits of any of these potential projects. And this is a huge amount of work on behalf of you and the whole team. Where did the idea to undertake this work come from, and what do you hope the public takes away from it?
So first of all, it's not just about the trains, it's about mobility. I like buses too, and light rail, all modes, paratransit. So really, I think the great thing about this region is the fact that there's no debate about whether transit's a good idea or not. That's a given, right? The debate is about how do we keep it running and where do we go from here. And there's a lot of great ideas that are out there on how to enhance the system from a variety of different sources, from the grassroots, from the agencies themselves, from local governments, a lot of ideas. And the question is, how do we understand how those ideas compare relative to one another? And so what we did was we looked at best practices for how you can compare improvements in the transit realm. And that's where we came up with that evaluative criteria that you flashed on the screen a little earlier. You know, obviously people think about cost and ridership, right? How are people going to use the system? But also, what's the outcome, right? You know, how does it save people time? Everybody time. How is it equitable in taking care of people who have been in historically disadvantaged communities? How can we enhance mobility in a broader sense? And so what we've done is we looked at best practices around the country and around the world on how people evaluate these projects. And the idea is to provide information to inform the discussion going forward. Not to end the discussion, but to start the conversation, really, and inform our policymakers so that they can make choices based not on who screams the loudest, but on data and look at it in an objective manner.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. I think you've accomplished that. Frederica, where do we go from here? How does this document help inform the 5-year capital plan, and who needs to be part of the next steps?
So as I said, this document, the 20-year needs, is the outcome of an extensive agency process, and that process really is going to lead seamlessly into the development of the 5-year plan. Right? We work with the agencies, and they know what things are the most urgent, the most important. We also bring in our colleagues from construction and development, the expertise that they have and the learnings that they have from implementing this capital program. How do you put projects together? How do you take the opportunities of different assets that need to be worked on, and what other things can you combine with that? How do you put things together to deliver the program, the fastest, the most cost-effective way? So we will bring in, all of our experts from around the agencies. We also know that our stakeholders are participants in this conversation, and people will be engaged. I really look forward to, talking about these assets more and educating people even more than we have been able to do through the development of this capital program. And we understand people are going to tell us what they also think are important and the priorities that they have. So but it's great through this document to be starting from this foundation of a mutual understanding of the system.
One more for Alyssa. Alyssa, you assembled a great team who are now, many of them MTA lifers, many new folks. There were a lot of late nights, down in the details of a lot of analytics, but all connected to very real outcomes in terms of what we do in this system. So, can you give us a couple examples of rabbit holes that you went down, and where did it lead us in terms of changing the assessment of need here?
Yeah, no, I think like the rabbit holes are very relevant to this exercise, right? The need that we have is vast, and actually every single rabbit hole is really important, and trying to get that conveyed at a higher level. So that was one of the exercises, is how do we get out of the rabbit hole of how do we get out of the rabbit holes. And so we really have tried to do that in this exercise. I think one that in particular where we felt like we had, I'm just going to pick one, although there are many. Frederica spoke a little bit about the relationship with the agencies and putting together the plan, and the partnership that we did there was something that was, I would say, quite remarkable. And I'm just going to pick one, which is New York City Transit and their power system, and the level of detail of analysis that we were able to get to in partnership with them. And that included both looking at the condition of those substations and all of the pieces that support those substations, the third rail, the cable, everything else that goes into it, the power control center, going at the sort of like macro level of what's the condition of the substation itself, but peeling back that onion and looking at the components that make it work. And not only were we able to do that, but we also looked from a geospatial perspective, how do those substations work together to deliver service, looking at the maintenance hours that go into facilitating, making sure that there's power there every day. And all of those things together really allowed us to put together a level of analytics that's going to serve us well as we put together the 5-year plan.
Excellent. Spend a lot of time talking about substations. Last question just for each of you. We'll start with Mike. What was the most interesting takeaway from this process?
I think it really was fascinating to see all of these great ideas for enhancement of transit in our region all lined up with one another, and to see how they performed. I think that was great. The other great takeaway is the teamwork. I have a terrific team of colleagues that I work with, and I learn every day from them. I learn new things. Was learning things this morning. I mean, you know, it's a terrific environment to really work in, and I think everybody has the passion in the right place. We all want to make transit better, and I think the takeaway was just seeing that level of commitment on the part of all my colleagues, as well as obviously the projects are always going to be the projects there, but you know, we want to do right, and we'll work with our colleagues throughout the region to try to do what's right for transit and mobility in the region.
Alyssa?
I would say that getting to know people out in the agencies and seeing the heroic work that they do to make the system run every day, and trying to highlight the needs that they have to make that the capital program work to meet their needs, that was the most astounding and interesting part of the project.
And last word to Frederica.
Oh, I got it. Okay. So I think the biggest takeaway for me is actually well represented in the document. I think we can see a path forward, right, to getting the system that we want. We can see how we can make the investments that renew and rebuild the infrastructure that we have. We see how we can meet our customer expectations, and we see how we can build a very resilient network that is, you know, ready to serve the region well into the future. So I'm really optimistic about it, and with the commitment that the legislature and the governor have already shown to the operating budget and translating that onto the capital program, you know, I'm very, you know, positive about what we will be able to accomplish into the future, and how the region will look in the future.
Great. That's a good note to end on. So the 20-year needs assessment is now posted online. I think we had the link up. Shouldn't be hard to find. We appreciate everyone being here today and all of your contributions to this. One last shout out is to the MTA C&D President's Office, who really dropped everything the last few weeks to make sure that this thing made its way into the world, and I think we're all going to be better for it. So thank you all for coming. Tim, I think we're doing a little a photo with everyone on the planning team, and then we'll come back for press questions. Thank you. right, thank you. So we're moving into some press Q&A. We just had an overview of the 20-year needs assessment and are really proud of that effort. We're proud of where it's going to take us next, which is full funding for our capital program needs. And as we mentioned, we're really trying to emphasize the paramount priority is rebuilding our existing system. After that, we get to improving our system, and after that, it makes sense to start talking about some expansion projects as well. And we've been very careful and gone through very rigorously doing the work on that comparative evaluation to make sure that we're being responsible. We're conservatively scoping and estimating projects, so we're very realistic with the public and elected officials and stakeholders and riders about what may or may not make sense to invest in the future. And with that, we'll take your questions.
All right, let's start with the Dean of the New York City Press Corps right there, Marcia Kramer from CBS 2. Marcia.
So I have two questions. The first question is this. How much of the money that's going to be raised from congestion pricing will pay for this, and will you need more money to go into the capital program in addition to the money raised by congestion pricing?
So the proceeds from congestion pricing, which we're working towards, are going to fund the rest of this capital program, the rest of the needs that we have. And that's really important because this capital program is 83% what we call core infrastructure. That's state of good repair and system improvements. So all the work that we're doing right now, really critical state of good repair work that we're investing in, that means that we can move on and do more state of good repair work and make more system improvements, provided that we have the congestion pricing funding to fund the rest of this program.
So I have a follow-up before I have another question. So if this is only going to fund this capital plan, where are you going to get the rest of the capital dollars needed to do the repairs like the Park Avenue Viaduct and Grand Central, which seems to be a really critical thing that you have to do?
Right, that's the work of the next year. And as we put the capital program together, and our capital programs have always been composed of contributions, support from a lot of different sources. There is MTA bonding capacity, MTA debt, but we always make sure that we have support from the governor and the state legislature. The city plays a major role, and the federal government plays a major role in funding the capital program, both through formula funding that we get really automatically, although we need the appropriations from the federal government to be maintained at the scale that they've been ramped up to in President Biden's Infrastructure Act. And also discretionary grants for projects, which we're aggressively pursuing at all times. And, I know that the chair, I'm sure he'll, if I don't say it, he will. We carry roughly 40 to 45% of the nation's mass transit riders. Even with the increases in formula funding, we only get about 17 or 18% of the federal government's transit funding. And so we need to continue to take advantage of those discretionary programs to continue to build out the system.
Can I just add one thing? So, but Marcia, the statutory framework is really important here. This report that we're doing is required by law, and it's required to be delivered more than a year before the capital program is due. So it was October deadline for this report. We're fulfilling that. I literally sent the letter and the submission to the so-called CPRB today, and 15 months from now, by the end of 2024, we have the capital program. So we're getting this on the table so that the discussion can begin about how much can we fund in light of the needs. That's what's happening today. We're identifying the needs and let the discussion begin about how we're going to get there to what you asked, which is full funding.
So my second question is this. It seems to me that the report has basically two parts. The sky is falling part, which basically says if we don't do these repairs, it's going to be terrible. From the Park Avenue Viaduct to the Hudson Line being underwater, the stations in the Long Island Railroad, et cetera. And then the things that we can do to improve the system and expand the system. So my question to you is, some of the things that you're talking about in expansion are really exciting. And the question is whether you will have the money to do the expansion part, since you have to do the sky is falling part.
It's a good question. I would only just, I don't disagree with your assessment, except that there's a lot of connections between those two things, right? This is, I understand. This is an existing system. It's $1.5 trillion asset. We're not out in a green field thinking about building a new transit system. So in order for us to improve the system, improve our signals, or run elevators, or pull fiber through our tunnels so that people can connect on their cell phones while they're riding continuously in the trains, we need power. And the power comes from those hundreds of substations that are threatened to fall into disrepair. In order to achieve the on-time performance that everybody's looking for and timely performance, we need to make sure that our track's in good shape so that we have fewer disruptions, that our rolling stock, our train cars, our buses, our commuter rail cars, that they are functioning, and they are functioning much better, as Jano said earlier, than they were in the past, but we need to renew 63% of them in this program. So all of that investment in rebuilding is really also a part of improving the system, and that's what we're emphasizing here today. And we're emphasizing the importance of rebuilding and improving the existing system. This is not new. 83% of our current capital program is rebuilding and improving the existing system. After you've taken care of those critical needs, the meat and potatoes, then you get to the additional potential for expansion. And we can't say right now, all we are saying today is that we've looked at potential proposals for expansion and evaluated them all on the same playing field so that we can, we and the public and stakeholders can make decisions, but there's no commitment here to any kind of funding. We need to see how that goes, with the priority being rebuild and improve the existing system.
All right, we go to Sonia Rincon back there from Channel 7, Eyewitness News. Sonia.
Thank you. I didn't hear any mention of how congestion pricing might affect ridership, and if there's any sort of projection, since we're talking about needs over the next 20 years, as to what kind of shift that might have on demand and on the wear and tear and on the expansion.
Okay, newsflash, the numbers that are projected to add to ridership on our mass transit system as a result of congestion pricing are 75 to 100,000 people a day. We are down 2 million riders from COVID, from pre-COVID. So we have plenty of the capacity to accommodate all of the people, based on the analysis that's been done, a lot of analysis, who might be moving to transit as a result of congestion pricing. The capacity is there, we have plenty of room, and what we're trying to do here is to make sure they come to a system which is going to continue to deliver great on-time performance and maybe even better on-time performance in the future. We want to have a great system for all those people, but there are many fewer of them than the capacity we have in the system right now.
All right, on to Greg Mocker back there from Pix 11. Greg?
Could someone talk about the way that projects are being evaluated? What's different about how you are approaching this? Are you prioritizing things different? What's the approach?
This is a new approach, a much more rigorous approach to the way that we look at projects. So for our existing system, and again, you know, this is a massive system, hundreds of stations, hundreds of miles of track. That is being looked at in terms of the state of good repair of that system. So what condition is each aspect of the system in? And we've done lots of work to evaluate that. That will lead us to projects, because we'll go and prioritize where we see components that are in the greatest state of disrepair to get them into a state of good repair. We also have taken a similar analytical approach, a rigorous approach to a comparative evaluation. The difference is, in the past, we've had individual projects that were a good idea, someone was really interested in, let's go take a look at it. Maybe you use a different method, you look at it as if it was being built next year or last year or 2 years from now. You look at it statically without necessarily thinking about how riders move based on a new component being added to the system. We've done a completely different thing now. We've looked at the costs of all these projects, potential costs, all as if they were being built in the same way, in the same year, so that we can judge them against each other. And we've used a very complex modeling system to see how dynamically things move around if we were to build an expansion project. And the result of all that is a very clear-eyed view of what it would cost and what the benefits are of each potential expansion project. And that's the beginning of a public dialogue. What we wanted most to do was to give everybody a real clear sense of what are the benefits, what are the costs of these projects, so that now we can begin to discuss them further.
But I just want to underscore one thing, Greg, which is what's different about this is we're saying to New Yorkers, you have an asset that is life or death for us as a region. It's worth $1.5 trillion. We have, all of us, have to be responsible stewards. The MTA is giving information to make sure everybody understands what's at stake. When I go out to the Livonia Yard, where the number 3 trains are serviced, and see that it looks like something out of a Netflix documentary on the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, that you can't get on top of the car to service the air conditioning. You want to know why there's some hot cars in the summer? Not that many, because you can't service the air conditioning. Because the image, it's like an old trolley barn that wasn't designed for subway cars, and they're so close together you can't work on the side of the car. The trenches underneath where the workers go are so shallow that they have to crab walk around to try to do work, and they don't get as much done as a result. We're trying to make sure that everybody understands that these decrepit, aging conditions, we're providing great service every day, best in 10 years. The Metro North has got 97, 98% service every day, but the Grand Central train shed is falling apart. Water, salt, chemicals, utilities poking holes in that tunnel that's on that network that's underneath Park Avenue. If we let that continue to collapse, nobody's going to be coming in from the Bronx or Westchester or Connecticut. We're trying to make sure everybody has the information so that we can have a much more robust public dialogue about what are we going to invest and what are we going to prioritize.
And we wrap up today's dialogue with Andrew Siff right there from WNBC. Andrew.
On the expansion front, you did mention a particular expansion route, and to paraphrase my friend and cameraman Justin, if you say to your 5-year-old, we might have ice cream later, but we might not, the 5-year-old is going to hear we might have ice cream and focus on the positive.
Andrew, I have only one thing to say. Happy birthday, Justin. Okay. Right?
It is Justin's birthday.
Okay, is that
a
sufficient answer to that question?
The question is, now that you've introduced...
Cake's on the way today, Justin.
Now that you've introduced the notion of expanding the 2nd Avenue subway west across 125th Street, people are going to hear that today and think that you're taking it seriously. So are you taking it seriously enough that before the tunnel boring machine goes into the ground, presumably in the next couple of years, you would know for sure whether it was only tunneling as far as the Lexington line or going all the way west to the 1 line? And basically, does that put you on the clock for about a year now to figure out if you can actually do that project?
It's an interesting idea, Andrew. But we're singly focused on executing what we have now. And as you know, we're on the verge of starting the 2nd Avenue subway project, this long-needed extension up to 125th Street in Lexington. It's been decades in the making. We finally are on the cusp of having the funding needed based on congestion pricing and the agreement with the federal government to put a shovel in the ground and get going on that extension. That's our singular focus. It's far too early to say whether we would be able to fund one of these projects, add one of these projects. Certainly, as you describe, it would be moving to the west of the existing project, and there's some interesting synergies there, but it's too early to say that we'd be able to invest in it. And we're merely pointing out that we've done this evaluation, and people will judge for themselves, but these are a couple of things that rise to the top.
But just as a quick follow-up to that, you introduced this idea that you have to do these projects efficiently. So once you have the ground open up and the shovel in the ground, you can't close that up and then 3 years later say, oh, we should have gone further west. So what I'm getting at...
You should drop everything and join the MTA planning team, clearly. The main point is, give that ice cream you promised to Justin. End of conversation.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.